William held tightly to the small cloth bag that carried everything left of his life. 74 years of hard work, sacrifices, and unconditional love had been reduced to this, a backpack, a park bench, and the bitter memory of the grandchildren who had left him in ruin. Annie and Thomas, the two children he had raised as his own after losing their parents, had simply abandoned him. There were no tears, no apologies, nothing. Just a cold conversation and the door closing for the last time. To them, William had become a burden. But what they didn't know was that the silence of this man hid the most painful truth of all, a revelation that would make them wish they had never made that decision. That day felt worse than most. The overcast sky mirrored exactly how William felt inside. He couldn't tell if it was the cold wind or his sadness that made him tremble as he tried to gather his thoughts. Looking at the few coins left in his pocket, he wondered how things had come to this. It had all started with small signs, the growing distance, the excuses to avoid conversations, the impatient look in Thomas's eyes whenever William needed help with something. Then came the final decision. There was no longer room for him in their lives. But how could it be so simple? After everything he had done for them? William was certain there was something wrong, something deeper. It wasn't just ingratitude, it was something darker. He tried to understand, but the pain and abandonment were overwhelming. He wondered if he would ever know why his grandchildren had betrayed him like this. What he didn't know was that the truth would come, and when it did, it wouldn't spare anyone. William had always been a simple man. He worked as a mechanic in a small shop in the town where he grew up. He lost his wife early on, and when his grandchildren, Annie and Thomas, were born, they became his new reason to live. After the accident that took their parents, William knew he couldn't give up. He put aside any dreams he might have had to make sure those kids had everything they needed. In the end, the shop was what kept the three of them going. On cold mornings, William would wake up before dawn, prepare coffee, and head off to work. Even exhausted, he would return home with a smile. When he opened the door, Annie would run to hug him, and Thomas, still small, would follow behind with clumsy steps. He remembered those days with a heavy heart, they felt so far away now. No matter how tired he was, he always found time to help them with homework, watch a movie, or tell stories before bed. Whatever little money was left over, he saved carefully. William didn't want his grandchildren to realize how hard it was to make ends meet. The new clothes they wore. Many times, he went weeks eating only bread and soup to afford them. To him, the sacrifice was small compared to the joy of seeing them smile. As time passed, William watched Annie grow into an ambitious young woman. She dreamed of working in fashion and often talked about moving to a bigger city. Thomas, quieter, had a talent for computers and spent hours studying at the school library. William was proud of both of them. He never let on how much he had to sacrifice to give them those opportunities. But over time, things began to change. During their teenage years, Annie started avoiding long conversations with her grandfather, always in a hurry or distracted by her phone. Thomas, once so close to him, preferred to stay locked in his room or left without saying where he was going. William didn't complain, he understood they were growing up. Still, an emptiness began to grow inside him. The turning point came on Annie's 18th birthday. William had prepared a simple dinner to celebrate, with her favorite dish, spaghetti and meatballs. But that night, she didn't come home. A friend had invited her out, and she went without letting him know. He sat at the table for hours, the cake he had baked sitting untouched on the counter. When Thomas arrived later and saw his grandfather sitting in the dark, all he said was, "Annie must be busy, Grandpa." William pretended everything was fine, but that night, something inside him began to crumble. The following years brought more distance and fewer explanations. They still respected him, but the warmth and affection became rare. Conversations about their future, once so lively, started to feel impersonal, as if he were a stranger. William clung to the happy memories to keep going. He believed, no matter what, that Annie and Thomas would always come back to him. But he was wrong. The days when Annie and Thomas filled the house with laughter were long gone. Now, as William sat at the kitchen table, his only companions were the ticking clock on the wall and the creak of empty chairs. The house felt bigger, colder. He remembered when that same kitchen was where the grandchildren argued over who got the last piece of cake. But now, they were just memories. Annie got an internship in another city and only came home for holidays, when she came at all. Thomas, though still living with William, was barely there. He spent his nights locked in his room, leaving early and avoiding any meaningful conversation. William felt the bond between them slipping away, but he didn't know how to stop it. One Sunday morning, William tried to revive the old tradition of having breakfast together. He prepared everything carefully: fresh bread, hot coffee, even fried eggs, Thomas's favorite. "Want to have breakfast, son?" he called, gently knocking on the door. "Already ate, Grandpa." "Thanks." The reply came without Thomas even opening the door. William set the cup down on the counter and tried to smile to himself, as if it didn't matter. But inside, the feeling of being left behind grew stronger. He began to wonder if he had done something wrong. Had he been too strict? Or maybe, he thought, young people just didn't need others as much as he had believed. When Annie finally showed up for Christmas, she arrived in a rush. She sat on the couch for a few minutes, scrolling on her phone, then left, saying, "I have to meet some friends." William tried to hide his discomfort, but as he looked at the Christmas tree he had decorated himself, he realized how meaningless the moment had become. He thought about how quickly life changed. Years ago, Annie and Thomas had been the reason he fought every day. Now, with every short visit and brief conversation, he felt more like an obligation. One night, Thomas came home late, headphones hanging around his neck and his eyes distant. William tried to strike up a conversation. "How was your day?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Fine. I'm going to bed." "Good night, Grandpa." Thomas went upstairs without waiting for a response. William stayed on the couch, staring at the dark television. The truth was becoming increasingly clear: his grandchildren had changed, and he was being left behind. What he didn't know was that this distance was just the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would leave him alone and force him to face a void he had never imagined. It was a morning like any other. William sat on the wooden kitchen chair, gazing out the window at the quiet street. Outside, neighbors came and went, carrying bags or chatting with one another. Inside the house, the silence was heavy. He was accustomed to the monotonous routine, but that day felt emptier than usual. Thomas was locked in his room, and there had been no news from Annie for weeks. William tried to push the thoughts aside, but the tightness in his chest was hard to ignore. He remembered Thomas's 20th birthday, celebrated a few months earlier. William had saved for weeks to buy a simple yet elegant watch he thought his grandson would love. When he handed over the gift, Thomas opened the box and, without hiding his disappointment, said, Thanks, Grandpa. But nobody really wears these anymore." William pretended it didn't bother him. He smiled and mumbled, "You can exchange it for something you like better," but inside, he felt humiliated. The same boy who used to run to show him his school drawings now seemed to see him as unimportant. With Annie, things were even more complicated. During one of her rare visits, William had tried to talk about her life, just like he used to when she was a teenager. But Annie, distracted by her phone, replied with short sentences. When he mentioned the piling bills, hoping she would at least show some concern, she sighed in irritation. "Grandpa, I told you I'm swamped with work. I can't handle everything for you." Her words echoed like a blow. He didn't want her to handle everything. He just wanted a gesture, a word, a little attention. He didn't need money, just the reassurance that he still mattered. That night, William went to bed early. Sitting on the edge of his mattress, he stared at the dusty photo frame on his nightstand. It was an old picture taken at a park. Annie and Thomas were laughing, holding hands with him as they played on the swings. He remembered that day as one of the happiest of his life. But the contrast with the present was devastating. Without realizing it, he began to cry. It wasn't just sadness, it was a deep pain, the kind felt by someone who had given everything and was now treated like a burden. He started to question whether he had gone wrong raising them. Had he been too loving? Should he have set more boundaries? But no matter how many questions he asked, the answers wouldn't come. One day, while tidying up the house, he found an old note tucked away in a drawer. It was a card Annie had made for him as a child. On the colorful paper, written in crooked letters, it read, "Grandpa, you're the best in the world. I love you all the way to the stars." William ran his fingers over the words, as if trying to feel that love again. But the yellowed paper seemed to be all that was left. He slipped the note into his pocket and went back to cleaning, trying to push the thoughts away. But things didn't improve. Thomas began avoiding his grandfather even more, and Annie, always busy, stopped answering his calls. William realized he was alone, even with the doors of his house still open. And no matter how much he tried to convince himself that this was just a phase, something inside him told him the relationship was breaking beyond repair. And he was right. It was a cloudy late afternoon when William heard firm footsteps in the hallway. He was sitting in the armchair in the living room, flipping through an old photo album, when Annie and Thomas appeared together. It was rare to see them talking lately, let alone side by side, as if they had something important to say. William looked up, trying to hide his mix of surprise and hope. Could they be here to talk to me, he thought. Thomas was the first to speak, but there was something strange in his tone. It wasn't the shy, affectionate boy William knew, his voice was dry, almost cold. "Grandpa, we need to talk." William closed the album and looked at them attentively. Annie crossed her arms and seemed impatient, as if she wanted to get it over with. He felt the air in the room grow heavier before the next words were spoken. "We've decided it's better if you don't stay here with us anymore." For a moment, William thought he had misheard. He leaned forward slightly, as if he needed to hear it again to be sure. "Not stay here anymore." "Look, it's nothing personal, but it's gotten difficult," Annie interrupted, fiddling with her phone as she spoke. "You know, money's tight, and we can't keep taking care of you." "Taking care of you?" Those words hit like a punch. William opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at them, searching their faces for any trace of guilt or regret, but he found only coldness. Thomas continued, almost as if reading from a rehearsed script. "We talked, and we think the best thing is for you to go somewhere they can take better care of you, you know. Like a retirement home." Retirement home. William felt his stomach churn. This house, the home he had built with so much effort, was no longer a place for him. The idea of being kicked out by his own grandchildren was almost unbearable. He tried to recall all the times he had sacrificed for them to have the best. And now, this? "You're saying you don't have room for me?" he asked, his voice trembling. Annie rolled her eyes. "It's not just that, Grandpa. It's that, you need care we can't give you." But William knew that was just an excuse. It wasn't about care, it was about convenience. He looked at the two of them and felt as if he didn't recognize them anymore. Where were the kids who laughed with him at the park? Who begged him to tell bedtime stories? He tried to argue, to remind them of everything they had been through together, but the words felt useless. Annie and Thomas had already made their decision, and nothing he said would change it. Realizing that insisting would only deepen his humiliation, he simply lowered his eyes and whispered, "I understand." But he didn't understand. He couldn't accept that the people he loved most were pushing him away as if he were a disposable burden. That night, William packed his bags, placing only the essentials in a small cloth bag. He left the house before dawn, so he wouldn't have to face his grandchildren again. As he walked down the deserted street, his heart heavy, he wondered how it had come to this. He had devoted his life to raising Annie and Thomas, and now it felt like it had been ripped away from him. Deep down, he also knew that this wouldn't be the last time he'd think about it. The silence of the street, mingled with the pain of saying goodbye, was only the beginning of something even more painful. The cold that morning felt harsher than ever. William, hunched over with his cloth bag in hand, walked along the sidewalk like a man with no destination. He had no plan, no place to go, all he knew was that he could no longer return to the house he had called home for so many years. With every step, the weight of his grandchildren's abandonment grew harder to bear. He thought of everything he had done for Annie and Thomas, the happy moments that now seemed like they belonged to a different life, and how, in the end, he had become disposable. With not enough money to rent a place, William found temporary shelter in an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The space was damp, dark, and smelled of mildew, but it was the only place where he could escape the biting wind. There, he spread out an old blanket on the floor and settled in, trying to ignore the crushing emptiness that surrounded him. Each night felt like an eternity. He would close his eyes, but sleep never came. Thoughts haunted him, the faces of his grandchildren, the laughter from when they were children, and that final conversation he desperately wanted to forget. Mornings were even harder. With nowhere to go, William wandered the city, looking for something to distract him from the pain. Sometimes, he found a park bench where he could sit and watch people passing by. He tried to convince himself it was only temporary, that his grandchildren might realize their mistake and come looking for him. But the days turned into weeks, and nothing changed. His money, already scarce, soon ran out. William began relying on the kindness of strangers for food. At a downtown cafe, a waitress named Margaret, her gray hair tied back in a loose bun, started giving him leftover food. It was a simple gesture, but to William, it meant the world. "Are you okay?" she asked one day, handing him a bag with bread and cold coffee. William tried to smile, but his voice came out weak. "I'm trying to be." Despite Margaret's kindness, William knew he couldn't depend on her for long. He began searching through trash bins, hoping to find something salvageable. Every time he dug through the garbage, a pang of shame struck him. It wasn't just for himself but for the man he used to be. The grandfather who worked tirelessly to put food on the table was now here, begging and scavenging for scraps. One day, as he walked along a busy avenue, he saw a family crossing the street. A man pushed a baby stroller while a woman held a child's hand. The sight made William stop in his tracks. He stood there, watching them until they disappeared into the crowd. His eyes filled with tears. He no longer had a family, and that was the hardest part. It wasn't the cold or the hunger, it was the absence of a home. But William's pain was invisible to the world around him. People walked past him without a glance, as if he were part of the scenery. Some avoided looking at him altogether, while others quickened their pace. William began to understand what it meant to be forgotten, not just by the ones he loved but by society as a whole. One night, on his way back to the abandoned building, William encountered a group of teenagers looking for trouble. They laughed and pointed at him as if he were a spectacle. "Hey, old man, lose your way home," one of them shouted, while the others roared with laughter. William didn't respond. He simply lowered his head and kept walking. But inside, the humiliation burned. He thought about how easy it was for people to judge, how no one knew who he was or what he had been through. But, in the end, none of it mattered. He was alone, and the world didn't seem to care. That night, lying on the cold floor of the abandoned building, William stared at the dark ceiling and offered a silent prayer. He no longer prayed for his grandchildren or for the past. He only wanted a little peace. William sat hunched on a park bench, wrapped in a worn-out coat he had found days earlier. The cold wind bit at his skin, but he was used to it by now. His eyes were fixed on the swaying trees as he held a piece of stale bread that Margaret had given him that morning. It was just another afternoon, with nothing to suggest his life might change. Then, a woman in her 50s approached slowly. She carried a bag of groceries and wore a red scarf that looked hand-knitted. She stopped a few steps away and observed him for a moment. William didn't notice her until she spoke in a gentle voice. "Would you like a hot coffee?" Startled, William looked up. It wasn't common for anyone to stop and speak to him. He hesitated for a moment, but the cold and his weariness won out. "Yes, thank you." The woman pulled a thermos from her bag and handed it to him. As William clasped the cup with his trembling hands, savoring the warmth he hadn't felt in a long time, she sat down beside him. "My name is Mary," she said with a soft smile. William mumbled his name in response but kept his eyes on the coffee. He wasn't used to kindness and didn't know how to react. Mary noticed his hesitation but didn't push. She sat quietly, giving him time to feel comfortable. After a few minutes, William broke the silence. "I'm not used to having someone sit next to me." Mary tilted her head, as if trying to understand his words better. "Why not?" He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question. "Because people don't stop to see who I am. They just walk by, look away, like I don't exist." Mary stayed silent, but something in her expression softened. She didn't press further, but for the first time in a long while, William felt like someone truly saw him. In the days that followed, Mary returned to the park. She always brought something, a sandwich, a bottle of water, or just her company. Over time, William began to trust her. He shared his story piece by piece, as if trying to rebuild a broken bridge. Mary listened attentively, never interrupting or judging. "I raised my grandchildren after my children were gone. I gave them everything," he said one afternoon, holding the framed photo he carried in his bag. "But in the end, I was thrown away." Mary looked at the photo in silence. The faces of Annie and Thomas, still children, smiling beside William, seemed to tell a completely different story. After a moment, she asked, "Do they know where you are now?" William shook his head. "If they do, they don't care." Mary didn't push further. Instead, she began asking questions about William's past, trying to understand how he had ended up here. She wanted to help but knew his trust was fragile and had to be earned gradually. One day, during their conversations, something William said caught Mary's attention. He mentioned a seemingly insignificant detail about the sale of the house he had shared with his grandchildren. He said he had no idea where the money from the sale had gone since he hadn't been involved in the transaction. Mary sensed something was wrong with that story but decided not to say anything. Not yet. As William stared into the distance, lost in his thoughts, Mary resolved to investigate. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she felt the truth behind William's situation was far deeper than he realized. The days passed, and Mary began to realize that William's story was far more complicated than he understood. While he spoke about his life with simplicity, she noticed gaps, strange details that didn't add up. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that something had been taken from him, something he himself wasn't aware of. One afternoon, Mary decided to take action. Using the few details William had shared about the sale of his house, she began to investigate. She went to the local records office, sifted through files, and spoke to an old acquaintance who worked in real estate. After hours of digging, Mary found what she was looking for. And what she discovered was devastating. The property William had left to his grandchildren hadn't been sold out of necessity, as he believed. Instead, it had been negotiated for a value far greater than he had imagined. The amount, which should have secured their futures, had simply vanished. The documents bore the signatures of Annie and Thomas. Mary felt a chill down her spine as she stared at the papers. She returned to the park where she knew she would find William. He was sitting on the same bench as always, his eyes fixed on the ground. When she arrived, he greeted her with a faint smile, unaware that something had changed. Mary sat beside him but hesitated to speak. She knew the news she carried was too heavy. "William. I need to tell you something." He looked at her, puzzled but attentive. Mary took a deep breath and handed him the documents. "I looked into the sale of your house. Anne. I found this." William took the papers with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the signatures, the amounts, every detail. For a moment, he seemed not to understand. But then, the truth began to sink in. They did this?" His voice was barely audible. Mary placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It looks like they did." William lowered the papers and stared at the ground. The silence that followed was unbearable. Mary could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle to accept that the grandchildren he had raised with so much love had taken advantage of him. "I can't believe it," he whispered, his voice heavy with pain. "Why would they do this to me?" Mary had no answer. She knew no words could ease the weight of that discovery. But she also knew William deserved the truth. In the days that followed, William was quieter than usual. He spent hours sitting in the park, clutching the documents as if still searching for an explanation. Mary continued to visit, bringing food and companionship, but she respected his need for space. She understood that he needed time to process. One evening, as they walked together, William finally broke the silence. "I always thought they were just busy, that maybe they had forgotten what I did for them. But this isn't forgetting. This is cruelty." Mary didn't know what to say. All she could do was listen. Slowly, William began to accept the truth, but that didn't mean the pain diminished. If anything, it seemed to grow with each passing day as he tried to understand how everything had come to this. But beneath the pain was something stronger, the need for answers. "I have to know why they did this," he said, looking at Mary with a determination she had never seen before. "I need to hear it from them." That afternoon, William decided he couldn't live with the doubt eating away at him. The truth about the sale of the house haunted him at every moment, like a heavy shadow. He needed answers. Mary, seeing the resolve in his eyes, offered to help locate Annie and Thomas. Despite his hesitation to confront his grandchildren, something inside William told him that this meeting was inevitable. They discovered that Annie was living in a modern apartment in the city center. It was a far cry from the simple home she had grown up in. The expansive windows and expensive furnishings made it clear that she had achieved a comfortable lifestyle, something William now understood had been built at his expense. As they arrived at the building, William felt his palms sweat. Mary held his arm, offering a silent look of support, and he took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. The sound echoed in his mind like a hammer. After a few moments, Annie opened the door. Her face showed surprise but also a hint of impatience. "Grandpa? What are you doing here?" she asked, her brow furrowed. William stood in silence for a moment, studying her. She looked different. The elegant clothes and confident posture seemed to belong to someone he no longer recognized. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm but filled with emotion. "We need to talk, Annie." She glanced at Mary, standing nearby, and sighed. "Fine, come in." The apartment was impeccably decorated but cold. There were no family photos on the walls, no objects that tied her to the past. William sat on the couch, looking around, while Annie remained standing, as if eager to end the conversation quickly. "I found out what happened with the house," William began, getting straight to the point. "The documents, the sale, everything." Annie's eyes widened for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Grandpa, I was just trying to help. Thomas and I thought it was best for everyone." "Best for who?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You sold the house where we grew up. The place where I raised you with so much effort. And you did it without telling me. You were too old to deal with all that." Annie shot back, raising her voice. "The house was too big, the bills were piling up. We didn't have a choice. William shook his head in disbelief. No choice. You didn't even give me the chance to decide. At that moment, Thomas appeared in the room, likely drawn by the raised voices. He stopped in the doorway, staring at William as though he hadn't expected to see him there. What's going on? He asked, nervously. I'm asking why you betrayed me, William said, turning to face them both. Why you sold the house and left me with nothing. Thomas glanced at Annie, hoping she would explain, but she remained silent. Finally, he said. We needed the money, Grandpa. We were just trying to move forward, to build our lives. William felt a mix of anger and sorrow welling up inside him. And to do that, you had to destroy me? The silence in the room was heavy. Annie tried to speak, but her words came out jumbled. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Grandpa. We didn't want things to be so hard for you. Then why did you leave me on the street? He interrupted, his voice filled with pain. All I wanted was to be with you. I didn't need luxury or comfort. I just wanted to be part of your lives. William's words hung in the air, and for the first time, Annie and Thomas seemed to grasp the weight of what they had done. William stood up slowly, tears in his eyes. I just wanted to understand why. But I don't think I ever will. He started walking toward the door but paused before leaving. Turning back, he said. I hope the money was worth it. Mary followed him, helping him out of the building. Outside, the air felt heavier, but William had a sense that he had done what he needed to do. He didn't know if it would change anything, but at least now, he had something he hadn't had before, clarity. That night, William returned to the abandoned building, but the cold seemed harsher than ever. He sat on the floor, his head in his hands, while Thomas's words echoed in his mind, we just wanted our lives. Each sentence from that confrontation felt like an open wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. He kept asking himself, over and over, how everything had come to this. Mary sat beside him, silent. There was something in William's expression that seemed different. He wasn't just sad, he looked broken. She wanted to say something, to offer some comfort, but she knew words wouldn't be enough. Then William broke the silence. I thought I had already felt all the pain I could, he said, his voice low. But now it's like they've erased me from their lives. Mary responded softly, her tone gentle. Maybe they're lost too, William. Sometimes people make bad choices because they don't know how to deal with their feelings. William shook his head, tears streaming down his face. No. This isn't about being lost. They knew what they were doing. They chose to discard me. As he spoke, William pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a letter he had written years ago when Annie and Thomas were teenagers. He held it for a moment before handing it to Mary. I wrote this for them. I never gave it to them, but it's the only thing I have left that feels like it means anything. Mary unfolded the letter and began to read. William's words were simple but filled with emotion. He wrote about how much he loved them, the sacrifices he had made to raise them, and how he wished for their happiness above all else. At the end of the letter was a line that made Mary's throat tighten. Everything I did was for you. If I'm ever not here, I want you to know that my greatest joy was being your grandfather. They need to read this, Mary said, folding the letter carefully. William sighed, his gaze distant. I don't know if it would make any difference now. That night, Mary decided she couldn't wait any longer. While William slept, she tucked the letter safely into her bag and made her way to Annie and Thomas's home. By the time she arrived, it was almost midnight. She hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. Thomas answered, his face marked by exhaustion and guilt. Mary? What are you doing here? She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, holding the letter as if it were a weapon. You need to read this. Now. Annie came down the stairs, looking confused. What's going on? Mary handed the letter to her without saying another word. Annie opened the paper and began to read, with Thomas peering over her shoulder. As William's words unfolded, their expressions shifted. Annie tried to maintain a composed exterior but couldn't stop the tears from falling. Thomas ran a hand over his face, as if trying to push away the weight of what he was feeling. "I didn't know Thomas began, but Mary cut him off. "You didn't know because you never asked. You never stopped to think about how he felt. You only cared about what was convenient for you." Annie closed the letter, placing it on the table with trembling hands. "What can we do now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mary looked at them both, her expression stern. "You need to do what's right. Before it's too late." Annie and Thomas spent the night in silence, sitting at the kitchen table. The letter lay open on the wooden surface, and neither of them could find the words to describe how they felt. Thomas stared at the floor, while Annie, her eyes red from crying, held the letter with shaking hands. "He never said anything," Thomas murmured, breaking the silence. "We thought." "Thought what?" Annie interrupted, her voice cracking. "That he was fine. That he didn't need us." Thomas didn't respond. He knew any attempt to justify their actions would sound hollow. The silence between them grew unbearable, filled only with the weight of everything they hadn't said to William. The next morning, they decided to search for their grandfather. They brought the letter with them, along with the hope of trying to make things right. When they arrived at the abandoned building where he usually stayed, they found only his old blanket folded in a corner and the bag he always carried. William was gone. Annie ran outside, panic etched on her face. "He can't have gone far," she said, scanning the area as if expecting to see him just a few steps away. Thomas, however, felt something different. There was a heaviness in William's absence that he couldn't explain. "What if he doesn't want to see us?" he asked quietly. Annie turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears. "We can't give up. Not now." They spent the day walking through the city, asking around at cafes, markets, and parks. But no one seemed to have seen William. With every negative answer, the weight of their guilt grew heavier. Thomas remembered all the times his grandfather had helped him with his homework, staying up late so he wouldn't feel alone. Annie, meanwhile, recalled the moments when William patiently braided her hair as a child, always kind, always present. But those memories were just that now, memories. As the sun began to set, they returned to the park where they used to play with William when they were little. They sat on the old wooden bench, side by side, in silence. Annie looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "We messed up, Thomas. Badly." "I know," he replied, still staring at the ground. "But I don't know if we can fix it." At that moment, Margaret, the waitress from the cafe who had often helped William, appeared. She approached slowly, holding a paper bag. "You're looking for William, aren't you?" Annie and Thomas stood up quickly. "Do you know where he is?" Annie asked, hope lighting up her face. Margaret hesitated for a moment before answering. "He came by yesterday. He seemed different. Quieter than usual. He asked me to give you this if you showed up." She handed the bag to Annie, who opened it hurriedly. Inside, there was an old notebook and a single folded piece of paper. Annie unfolded it and read aloud. "Everything I did was for you. I hold no resentment, but I can't carry this pain any longer. I hope you find what you're looking for, even if it doesn't include me." Thomas wiped his face with his hands, trying to hold back tears, while Annie collapsed onto the bench, sobbing. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice desperate. "Did he leave?" Margaret sighed, her expression somber. "He said he needed peace. I didn't ask anything else, but I think he decided to go his own way." Annie clutched the notebook tightly, as if it were her last connection to her grandfather. "What if he never comes back?" she whispered. Thomas, his gaze fixed on the ground, answered quietly. Then we'll have to live with it. They sat there on the park bench as night fell around them. William's absence was a void that couldn't be filled, and the weight of their guilt was a shadow that would follow them wherever they went. On the other side of the city, William sat on a different park bench, far from the places he used to frequent. It wasn't by chance. He knew Annie and Thomas were searching for him, but he wasn't ready to face them again. The pain of betrayal was still fresh, even after their emotional words during their last meeting. It was on a cold afternoon, as William left a small bakery, that everything changed. He didn't notice Annie and Thomas in the distance, walking tirelessly through the neighborhood in their search. When they saw him, it was as if the air had been knocked out of their lungs. "It's him!" Annie cried, running toward her grandfather. William froze. For a moment, he thought about turning away and leaving, but something held him back. When Annie reached him, tears were already streaming down her face. "Grandpa, please, please let us talk to you." Thomas quickly caught up, out of breath. He reached out his hand, but William didn't take it. Instead, he looked at both of them with a tired and serious expression. "What do you want?" Annie dropped to her knees on the pavement, not caring about the curious stares of passers-by. "We want you to come home, Grandpa. We want to take care of you. Like we always should have." "You don't know what you're asking," William said, averting his gaze. "Do you think you can erase everything that's happened?" Thomas stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "No. We know we can't. But we also know we can do better from now on. And we will." "Why should I believe you?" William asked, tears beginning to fall. "You abandoned me. You made me feel like I was worth nothing." Annie stood up, still holding her grandfather's hand. "Because we understand now. We understand how much we hurt you. And we won't stop trying to prove we're sincere, even if it takes our entire lives." William looked at both of them, his eyes brimming with tears. He wanted to push them away, to protect himself from being hurt again. But at the same time, he felt something different, something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. With a deep sigh, he finally murmured, "All right. But I'm not coming back to be a burden." Thomas shook his head. "You've never been a burden, Grandpa. Never." When they arrived home, Thomas and Annie had prepared everything. William's room was spotless, with fresh linens and a comfortable chair placed by the window where he liked to read. Annie had cooked his favorite dish, while Thomas carefully organized the few belongings William still had. That evening, the three of them sat at the table together for the first time in years. William was still hesitant, but there was something warm and reassuring about that moment. For the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, he could trust them again. In the days that followed, Annie and Thomas made small but meaningful gestures to show their effort. They accompanied him to doctor's appointments, helped him with finances, and, most importantly, were present. It wasn't just empty promises, they were taking real, tangible steps. William still carried the scars of their abandonment, but slowly, they began to hurt less. He knew it wouldn't be easy to forget, but he was willing to try. Deep down, he understood that forgiveness wasn't something given all at once, it was built, day by day, through love and patience. If you believe this story has the power to transform lives, give it a like so more people can watch this emotional journey. And stay tuned for another inspiring video. See you there.